Hi guys, Maikeru here. This is my video on the tier list for the most enjoyable bosses in Runescape. So let's get right into it. Before we get into this, I do just want to say this is my opinion on which bosses are the most enjoyable. It doesn't mean that it's going to mean the same for you, and you may have a different opinion. If that's the case, feel free to click the link in the description of this tier list made by Omid and make your own and tweet me on Twitter. I'm always interested to see what you guys think as well. This has nothing to do with money or nothing like that, so if a boss is really good money but boring to kill, it's going to get a low rating. So it's just going by how fun they are for me. So let's get into it. Starting out, Ambassador is our first one. I think Ambassador is a very well-made boss and probably the most enjoyable elite dungeon boss for me. I do enjoy Cereu quite a lot as well, but I think Ambassador is definitely the most complex and probably the most well-made, so I'm going to give that S tier, honestly. I think Ambassador is a really, really well-thought-out boss. AOD, again, is pretty amazing, but I think AOD is a little bit too much of a DPS dummy when you get very, very good at it. So just because of that, I'm going to probably put it in A tier. It probably would have gone S if it was less of just like an absolute nuke fest and you actually had to deal with a couple of the mechanics instead of skipping them. So I think that goes into A. Araxor is probably my favorite boss of all time. It's an instant S from me. The reason why Araxor is in the instant S is just because of how well crafted this boss is. It has 3 different paths which completely change the way that you fight the boss. When one path is closed, it's always going to be different to having another path closed, and that really impacts it as well. Each path gives you the leg piece to make the final item, which means you're forced to do each different type, which is really, really cool because then, you're not just going to farm the easiest thing over and over again. You actually have to do the ones that are a bit harder or a bit more annoying. The mechanics, everything, just fantastic. I think that's my favorite boss in the game. Then we have Astalon. Astalon is buggy and time-gated. I'm probably having someone re at me right now or whatever, but Astalon is an F tier from me. The fact that you can get a neutron star spawn before you even put the circle down on the floor is just an instant no-go from me. It doesn't happen very often, but it can. And then it's also super time-gated while you're waiting for everything to happen. You just have to sit there hitting nothing and, it's just a bit boring of a fight overall. Not the best in my opinion. Beastmaster is a good fight. I think Beastmaster is definitely a good one. Nowhere near as good as Yaka, but still a very, very fun fight. I'm probably going to put Beastmaster in B because there is a decent amount of rolls and it is a fun boss, but there could have been a little bit more to it. Blackstone Dragon is probably my favorite Elite Dungeon 2 boss, and I'm probably going to put him around the same as Beastmaster. Blackstone Dragon's a pretty fun one compared to Astalon. It doesn't really have any bugs, and yes, there's a couple of time-gated elements, but there really isn't that much. Chaos Elemental, I don't really know what I want to put for the Chaos Elemental. It's very, very easy. It's a wilderness boss, which I kind of like, but at the same time, the only mechanic is that it takes your armor off if you don't have a full inventory, and it's very, very weak nowadays. So I'm probably going to put that into E tier. I don't think it deserves F, but it's definitely low in terms of like enjoyment and mechanics. If you're a low level, it can be alright. Next up, we have Commander Ziliana. Doesn't really have many mechanics. Even for a Gold Wars Dungeon 1 boss, it's not really that fun. It just puts some lightning on the floor occasionally, and that's about it. And, when you're low gear, you kite it around the room. When you're high gear, you just nuke it. So I think it's about the same as the Chaos Elemental. E tier from me. Corp Beast, next up. I'm probably going to put Corp in D. I do enjoy the boss. I think it's cool that you can use an Odak coil. And it's like severely weak against spears, so that's a cool little mechanic. And yeah, the mechanics of Corp, like with the soul that goes underneath of you and stuff, is a little bit more entertaining and keeps you on your toes a bit more than Chaos Elemental. Okay, so now we've got the Leviathan, which is the first boss in ED3. It really, really, really punishes you if you don't stand on the correct side when it is doing its breath. You'll get killed very easily against this boss if you're not paying attention, and I like that. But at the same time, its, variety of mechanics is non-existent. It's pretty much just that mechanic, and then it swaps sides, and that's it. So because of that, I think that also deserves, like, an E tier. It really isn't that engaging, but it's the first boss in ED3. They're never that fun, the first bosses in Elite Dungeons. So it'll go there. Okay, so Dagon of Kings are actually really, really cool. They're one of the only bosses you can't just go in with like full out like melee gear or whatever and just nuke them all, because you physically cannot damage them unless you have the correct style, which then leads to some fun gameplay, some switching, especially with action bar key binding now. This boss is actually really fun. I think I'm actually going to put Dag Kings in C. I really like Dag Kings. They're very enjoyable. They keep you on your toes, and there's so many of them. So having a long respawn, but having 3 of them actually doesn't matter, because, you know, while you're waiting for it to respawn, you're going to be killing another one and then another one, and I think that's quite good. Grador's the same as Ziliana, except he has even less mechanics. Honestly, he goes behind Ziliana. Not very good. Giant Mole is actually not a bad boss. I think I'm going to put Giant Mole... It's probably going to sound weird by putting him into D tier. Like, the fundamentals of that boss is actually really, really good, and it's well made, so it deserves at least D. Gregoriovic is a pretty fun boss, but at the same time, it's also mostly just DPS him harder than he DPSs you. So because of that, I think he deserves around a C tier, because it is one of the more engaging bosses, but at the same time, you can now AFK him, which has made him a bit more devalued. But C tier is pretty good. Kiln. Okay. Hurakan as a boss is really bad. Really boring. Kiln as a whole isn't too bad. It's just, like, fairly easy now, right? But I think, you know, if we're judging it from Hurakan, not Kiln, just Hurakan, I think that boss fight's dumb. You kill some tentacles, he comes up, you DPS him, he literally deals like no damage to you, he goes back down, you kill some tentacles, you repeat it. Hurakan's just a really, really brain-dead boss and not fun at all. So honestly, I think Hurakan, for the time that it was made as well, definitely should have been better, especially with how good Jad was when it was first made. So being like Fire Caves version 2.0, I think that's F tier. It's just nowhere near as good as the original and like the original Jad fight and how good that was. They could have done much better. Hellweir, absolutely solid boss. I think Hellweir is my favorite God Wars Dungeon 2 boss and deserves A tier. My favorite way to learn defensive rotations and just a solid boss overall. Keeps you on your toes while also trying to do a lot of DPS. And yeah, the mechanics are very varied, very fun. Definitely deserves A tier for me. Next up is KK. Again, another solid A tier. I think I would rate KK a little bit more enjoyable than AOD personally, just because I love solo KK, and duo KK is pretty fun as well. The reason why I put KK up here so high is because it was the first ever EOC boss, and they introduced it and used your own EOC abilities against you with this boss. So KK's abilities are exactly the same as the ones you would use, just disguised in other stuff. For example, in the mage phase, when those balls explode, they can be a random ability. Sometimes they explode and put combust on you. Sometimes they explode and you take a ton of damage from like a wild magic or something, and it's crazy. So I just think that's really, really fun. And I think that boss deserves an A because of that. Not only does it, you know, have these cool abilities, it also can be melee range and mage, and it can swap in the middle of the fight to keep you on your toes. Very enjoyable. Okay, we have another very, very low tier boss. But I think just because it has that protection prayer and it kind of pushes it a little bit further, I think it deserves E tier. And I'd probably put it alongside Chaos Elemental just because I don't want to completely put it in F tier. Whereas on the other hand, KBD literally has 0 mechanics. That's a complete F tier, right? So because Calvite Queen has that protection prayer in those 2 phases compared to KBD, I think it takes that a little bit higher, if that makes sense. Criara, again, literally an AFK tank and spank boss. It's going to be the same as all the other God Wars, honestly, but I think it's a little bit more enjoyable than Grador and Ziliana, so I'd probably put it here. Krill, again, same thing applies, but at least Krill has that hard-hitting mechanic that punishes you, especially if you're not paying that much attention, so that's cool. But other than that mechanic, it literally doesn't really have much. So, yeah, I think I'm just going to stick Krill at the front of the God Wars Dungeon 1. I think Krill is the most enjoyable God Wars Dungeon 1 boss. Legios. Alright, Legios keep you on your toes all the time. And I like that every Legio has slightly different mechanics. It really, really teaches you how to, you know, kite and cast abilities. I guess you're not really kiting, but traveling while casting abilities and stuff, it really keeps you on your toes for that. And it really, really teaches you that. So because of that, I think I'm going to rate them in terms of enjoyment. They're pretty fun. I'll probably put them, honestly, at like B. I actually really enjoy the Legios. I have the title, low B, but still a B. Magister. It doesn't have many mechanics, and, you know, you can ignore half of them. So because it's kind of a DPS dummy, it's gonna be like where Greg is, but maybe a little bit more enjoyable than Greg, so I'll put him at mid-C tier. Then we have Masuta. Masuta is actually one of my least enjoyable bosses. He has the really annoying spinny mechanic where he turns into a Beyblade, and then he has the water mechanic that takes forever while he's flying. Then he comes down and you just DPS him, and that's literally the whole fight. So that fight's pretty boring, not super engaging, not super fun. I'd probably put that, honestly, with the Leviathan, I guess, around here, because they're about even. Next up, we have Normal Necks. So Normal Necks is also a really enjoyable boss and a super fun one for me. I personally love soloing Normal Necks, and even duoing Necks with a friend is pretty enjoyable as well, because it's quite chill in a duo and it's a good thing to chat with, or you can, like, you know, try hard a little bit and get some fast kills. Been doing it a lot on my Iron Man recently, trying to get Torva, so definitely an enjoyable one and not a bad grind. I think I'm honestly going to put Normal Necks around the same as AOD, but in obviously a regards to a solo boss compared to a group boss. I do think they're both very, very well made, both super fun to do and engaging, so that deserves a solid A tier as well. QBD. Alright, I'm going to probably do something that's a bit controversial on QBD, but I'm going to put QBD in A tier as well. A lot of you are probably thinking that I'm crazy putting QBD in A tier, but I think it's one of the best bosses, just like Hellweir, in really teaching you the ropes of PvM. It helped me so much when I was learning PvM with EOC. It has the fire mechanics that, you know, you can really, really time your movement well to make sure the fire doesn't hurt you, and then getting that tick perfect movement can help in other places. Same with the Tortured Souls. Then it also really teaches you on saving certain thresholds for certain times and phasing correctly at correct times as well. So because you have to physically phase it yourself, you're really, really like paying attention to the phasing, and then that can really help for other things in the future as well. And I think it's just a really, really good gateway boss that teaches you a lot of the fundamental basics of like what a boss encounter is, and that's why it deserves an A for me in terms of enjoyment and in terms of just how well it's made. Now we have Barrow's Rise of the Six. I think Rise of the Six is a really fun encounter, but sometimes it can be a bit wacky and a bit crazy, just because it has a couple of things that make it a bit too crazy at times, or it seems like a little bit buggy. Especially in the tunnels when leaving. I remember getting stuck underneath a rock and not being able to do anything and having to lobby while taking tons of damage and eating on my hard Criara man and nearly losing the account, you know, due to a bug of getting stuck under a rock. So just because of those bugs and stuff, it takes it down a decent amount for me. I think if it didn't have bugs, it'd be a solid like low A, but because of those bugs, I think it's going to take it down to a low B for me personally. If it didn't have those issues, definitely going to be an A. Alright, so now the first boss of ED1 is pretty much the same as the Leviathan and the Masuta. It's the same type of thing, very minimal combat required and not super fun and engaging mechanics, so it's going to go in the same place. I think it's a little bit more enjoyable than Masuta, so it'll go in the middle of them both. Cereu. Okay, Cereu is a cool boss. I think Cereu is really well made. Cereu on release was one of my more enjoyable things to do on release. It was actually super, super fun, especially in a group, and then trying it solo afterwards was a different kettle of fish entirely, right? Trying to get some 2 cycles in there is always really challenging as well, and all of these different things, so I think it really, really challenges so many different elements of your PvM playstyle. And, you know, it's a bit of an endurance test as well, especially if you can't do it in a couple of cycles. It's going to take you a very long fight. Because of that, I think Cereu is my highest A tier. I don't think it quite goes where Ambassador is, because I think Ambassador is a little bit better, but definitely my highest A. Solak, in terms of a boss fight, in terms of enjoyment and mechanics, Solak has to be an S. Solak on release was definitely my most enjoyable boss that I've ever killed on release, figuring out those mechanics, having fun, and just, yeah, it was absolutely incredible. I think it's one of the best made bosses in the game. There's so many different ways of doing it. Obviously, some ways may be more efficient than others, but because you can literally kill it in all of these different ways and do it fine, is very, very cool to me. Alright, we got Taraket. This boss sucks. This boss is absolute trash. It's just like Astalon. It's going into the F. I don't even need to say much about this boss. It literally sucks. It's time gated. It spawns minions. It heals itself. It's just annoying. Telos. A boss that I don't do too much of. I have about, I think it's 350% Telos done or something. So I really haven't done that much of it. I think I have like a bit over 100 KC. But from my experience with Telos, it is super well made. Its abilities are insane, its phases are really, really cool, and the way that you deal with so many of the different mechanics is definitely really, really, really fun, and getting things tick perfect is so rewarding. Just because of that, it challenges you to your limits, and that deserves an S on its own. Even though I'm not the biggest fan of Telos, I definitely can see why it is such a big boss, and you know, the 4K Enrage mechanic in general just makes that boss just such a big goal. You know, it's a really, really, really big achievement. So, very cool. Twin Furies. In terms of mechanics, they're decent. In terms of enjoyment, they're not so decent. They're like chill, but not chill enough that you can relax, because then they start pushing you around the arena. But I don't think it's going to be as fun as other Goals Dungeon 2 bosses. So, Twin Furies for me are going to go for a high D, I think. Jad. Okay, Jad is fantastic. I think Jad was made so well. Obviously, you gotta remember it's such an old boss, but it was that boss that everyone would strive for, get their fire cape, and they'd be balling. The fact that it punishes you so hard if you mess up is insane, and that's really, really cool, because it makes you feel so good when you successfully kill it without any mistakes. So I think Jad definitely deserves, even now, deserves to be in like C tier, just because it's such an iconic boss and it has such a good place in my heart, and I still enjoy killing Jads. I still find it quite fun. Varak Lith is next. Varak Lith is very repetitive, and it's kind of like a test of your DPS, but the mechanics aren't as bad as Astalon, but they're not as good as Blackstone Dragon. So because of how repetitive it is and how much HP it has, I think it's going to go around like the Twin Furies area. So I think I'll go just in front of Twin Furies. Yeah, we'll put it there. Next up, we have Vindicta. Vindicta is cool, but I don't think it's as cool as Hellweir. But it's definitely a good entry-level boss, and it really teaches you how to, you know, utilize your DPS. It's kind of like a DPS dummy that also has some fire, and, you know, a way to learn shield switching and prayer flicking. Again, definitely a very good boss that aided me in learning PVM and my DPS rotations. So because of that, I think it deserves B tier. And I think it deserves to go around the same as Rots. I don't think it's quite as fun as, you know, Beastmaster, but it's definitely enjoyable. Next up, we have Virago. So Virago, I think, deserves S, even though I don't do it too much. It's such a well-crafted boss, and it kind of comes under the same category of kind of like Solak, but an older Solak. It was the second ever EOC boss, and the way that it pushed you to your limit on release, and the fact that it was first ever boss that you could mount and stuff like that, really, really cool mechanics, and that deserves probably the lowest of the S's, but S nevertheless. And finally, my favorite group boss out there, Yakamaru, is going straight up second in the S tier. It's because it's kind of tied with Araxor. Araxor's my favorite solo boss. Yakka is my favorite group boss. The fact that you have so many different roles in Yakka, and if someone doesn't pull their weight and doesn't do their role, you can just instantly die and the whole group wipe, is just awesome. Really, really cool. Really amazing use of so many different mechanics, and I just loved doing raids. I love teaching people Yakka. It's one of the bosses that I have a weird amount of KC in. I have about 1,200 KC in Yakka or something, so I did it a lot and I really enjoyed it. So definitely right up there, big place in my heart. Yakka is 10 out of 10. And there we go, that is my finished tier list. Let me know in the comments down below whether you agree, whether you disagree, but I think I've been fair. You know, I don't really do Telos and I don't really do Virago, but they're still up there, and I think they deserve those spots. I guess if we're looking from back in the day, Goals Dungeon 1 bosses definitely could be moved a little bit higher, but I you know, nowadays they're just so easy, so AFK, I don't think they deserve to be that much higher. But yeah, that'll be it for today's video. Give the video a like if you did enjoy, subscribe if you're new for loads of future content all related to RuneScape free, and as always, until next time, see ya.